So it's great to join you all. And as Tom said, I'm going to talk mainly about the role of digital humanities, or DH, in unlocking archival collections, some of the current affordances of these methods, but also some of the outstanding limitations of them. We're humanities bringing to bear our humanities expertise onto technology. So we are not treating tech as a given at all, but something to be analysed further in a critical way. So we'll be doing some of that appraisal, some of that DH appraisal today as well. We're also going to be focusing on a particular case study collection, a folklore collection, held at my nearest repository, which is the University of Sheffield's Special Collections, Heritage and Archives. But before that, I want to ground us in a bit of DH theory. So what are the digital humanities, how they might relate to your role as archivists, a lot of you, or how they already relate, because there's a long interconnected history between archival science and DH, but also some of the broader contentions that need grappling with if we're effectively going to process our collections as data or bring some of these technologies to bear on our collections, either as smaller projects or at a larger scale as well. So roughly about 15 minutes for the theory, and then we'll swiftly move on to some more practical kind of workflow methods stuff specifically on the folklore collection as well. And then, ample time to ask questions as well, technical or theoretical. So I'll speed through this because my bio was on the event website and I don't want to spend too long talking about myself, but mainly just to situate my approach to these issues and some of our discussions further. I am an archivist, but I'm also a DH researcher, and those two things might be more of a natural merging than perhaps you ordinarily think. So I'm currently a research associate at the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of Sheffield. I lead the research theme Digital Representations of Cultural Artifacts, which is a bit verbose maybe, but it mainly tries to advance the state of the art in capturing physical material, physical cultural heritage material, thinking about its interpretation digitally and also its representation to archival audiences digitally as well. So much of this physical culture, as in our case today, takes the form of analog archival textual records as well. So as part of this research, I regularly use AI-enabled automatic text recognition, so ATR. You might know it by another name, which is handwritten text recognition, HTR, or some of the precursor tools, which are all OCR based. There's lots of acronyms. But basically the process of converting manuscript images into machine processable text so computers can read and further analyze it. So we'll be walking through some of these transcription workflows in a little while. The other thing I want to mention about my research background is that I often come to thinking about the tech, but thinking about digital humanities through a socio-technical lens. So looking beyond tools, about whether they work as intended, but actually toward how they change our encounters with historical information, our expectations of technology and how accurate they are, and also how archives are experimenting, understanding and implementing some of these digital technologies as well. So all of the technical stuff is informed by my background as an archivist. And I've done my fair share of the cataloguing collections and completing finding aids, that are the kind of bread and butter of the sector as well. So hopefully that grounds our discussion a little bit more. So to kind of think more broadly about the digital humanities, so DH is not kind of easily defined. There's no one core definition. And this is because a whole range of researchers might call themselves digital humanists. So that's anyone from a research software engineer background with more technical skills to people working in the computational linguistics, right? Thinking about text as language. However, Nyan and Flynn state that DH is characterized in its broadest form as encapsulated by the aim of transforming how the humanities encounter, transmit, question, interpret, problematize, and imagine artifacts and attitudes to them. So in doing so, they go on to say it differentiates itself from now routine uses of computing. So, we use word processors every day now as a standard technology. We don't necessarily come to use Microsoft Word and think about how, we're encountering it as a tool for the humanities. So there is a distinction there to be had. The Digital Humanities Institute, where I'm based, also suggests that, the field is concerned with the innovative use of technology and computation within humanities as both a method of inquiry and dissemination. So that's not to say that DH always needs to talk about state-of-the-art technology, the latest scanners, the fastest AI models, but instead, a lot of it uses established digital approaches that can be picked up with pretty limited coding knowledge or no coding knowledge at all. But it's that attempt to advance the humanities and humanities' ways of understanding that is the innovative bit, not necessarily the technology. So, there are also wider concerns within DH as well. So, we apply technology to better understand the humanities, but recursively, we're trying to critique the tools as well as we go about that. Assessing whether certain AI technologies, for instance, are ethically sound, robust, or transparent. So DH almost has like a mirrored effect. So you're both using but also studying the technology at the same time. And this follows what Adam Crimble says, that as we increasingly work with computers, computers will exert their influence on our intellectual agenda. So we must understand both their strengths and their limits that they impose on us. So that's kind of the broader framing. And I want to stress that, digital humanities is not a set subject or a list of approved tools. It's more of a methodology, kind of applied, more akin to the applied humanities, or maybe like a strand of philosophy. It's a broader approach. So why is this all relevant to archivists and collections, perhaps your own work? Well, archives are reflections of human creativity, of history, of materiality, of business operations in the case of business archives, and broader culture. They're inherently complex. They're arguably the most complex information that we have access to. So this, enables a thorough testing of technology. If we want to ask an AI to transcribe a really gnarly document, well, that's a better stress test than using, potentially more standardized information as well. At the same time, archival collections retain really granular historical information that needs bringing to bear, as part of our public understanding of history as well. So these DH technologies, we'll go on to see, can further aid the accessibility of these archival records, unlocking their contents and bringing this information to users in more intuitive and interactive ways. So in thinking of this natural meeting point, there's actually a long history of DH and archival collections. Many see DH as actually originating in using collections through the Index Thomisticus project, which was led by a Jesuit priest, Robert Bucer, who produced a concordance of Thomas Aquinas's Latin works through these mechanically punched index cards that you can see him holding up one. Others say, similar work by Roy Albert Wisby, who became, the first researcher to compile a concordance of medieval German text, were also, at the forefront of this technology. And by the 1970s, these technologies started to be incorporated into broader digital infrastructures. They became, to a degree, quite commercialized. Hewlett-Packard created kind of data banks of documentary transcriptions through their systems as well. And then we were off to the races, and we've kind of haven't stopped since then. Of course, this genesis of DH is a simple story. It was far more complex than that. And this narrative of Bucer and Visby has often traditionally excluded the female workforce who were at the forefront of providing, these projects, the actual labour. And Bucer especially predominantly hired female punch card operators. So we can see C2 here. Melissa Terrace has done some great works in actually being able to name some of these women who've fallen out of the archive and remain, in a lot of cases, nameless. But Bucer hired these card operators straight out of school and he also barred them for any management or research positions as well. Likewise, DH is currently contending with issues around where its infrastructure is set up, and also unbalanced resources, with a lot of projects, base architecture largely residing in the global north, privileging certain archives and collections, ways of understanding, and English as the lingua franca of digital research as well. So against this background, DH projects have also been directly pursued by archivists as part of the GLAM Labs movement, the collections as data movement as well. And these labs have kind of been described as experimental services developed in collaboration with users to test in a structured way their digital workflows, their missions, their programs, often operating as these kind of semi-independent, research-oriented kind of prototyping maker spaces as well. So these labs, all of this DH work in using collections is rooted in the values and priorities of the archival sector, creating digital workflows that prioritize information's findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, alongside broader principles of transparency, trust, representation, and community as well. So, in summing up DH, this is a very brief history of a complex field, but there's a long tail of actors, a lot of them archivists, and their labour that now supports this kind of vibrant digital research culture that we're enjoying now. So the last thing, as part of our kind of theory component and a final consideration, is that we should probably address, to a degree, the elephant in the room, which is this current AI boom that is continuing to a degree to pressure all sectors, but especially archives, to adopt automation as a source of low-cost efficiency. And this, places understandable worries on the sector about replacement, environmental sustainability, and also, data protections and risks surrounding intellectual property. So in tackling this, DH also has a role in supporting archivists in deciding what forms a suitable and actually an appropriate use of AI on collections. And a lot of this, as Nora McGregor at the British Library talks about, revolves around distinguishing between trad AI, what the National Library of Scotland sometimes likes to call boring AI as well. So that's AI that is based in much older machine learning algorithms, that date back to the 1970s, that are used to recognize patterns, sequentially predict information, and analyze data through rules-based approaches. And generative AI that we're becoming increasingly familiar with, that is suited to generating new content. So they're very different technologies. And to illustrate this, I don't know if anyone saw the Google AI Pro ad of, someone basically prompting Gemini's engine to create a watermelon elephant. Like, you would need that, even if you were a content creator. Not sure that you need that. Yet YouTube served it up to me about several dozen times. There are better uses of Gen AI, of course they are, but that difference between generating content and actually rules-based predictive algorithms that have really, better intersect with archives' mission of improving access to structured information through defined tasks. For instance, transcribing hard-to-read documents as well. So there's a bit of a gulf between AI use cases and actually how we should maybe think about these base algorithms as well. And the last thing I'll say is that actually extractive AI companies, providers are quite happy in flattening this distinction, which makes, DH expertise even more important in disentangling the two. Because without a familiar pattern of AI use that prioritizes suitable use cases, data protections issues arise, copyright infringement arrives, digital exclusions also arise as well. We don't know how this data is necessarily being handled by third parties. And this is all needed to, ensure that untrustworthy AI is not given, endorsement by the well-regarded cultural institutions that a lot of you will work in. But also that intellectual control over AI's development is not fully siphoned away from archives and the DH sector either. So certainly something to really mull over with a lot of contentions. I'll just check how we're doing for time. I think we're okay. So we've talked about kind of, DH as a field, some of the critical approaches that have stemmed from the field's research as well, and how maybe DH can help with some very live issues that archives are facing right now, for instance, AI. So this second part of the talk, I want to kind of move from conceptualizing DH to actually operationalizing DH methods as well. So we're going to talk about some established AI-enabled approaches and, the clear reason for using them on the University of Sheffield's folklore collections as well. So just a bit of background about the Survey of English Language and Folklore and the broader collection it sits within. So now that we've established the kind of DH context, we're going to talk about digital techniques and workflows that we've trialed on this survey. And this case study will hopefully demonstrate some of the potentials, some of the limitations in using digital workflows at the archival level to further user accessibility, resource interactivity, also archival description and digital scholarship. So starting in 1964, the Survey of Language and Folklore collected material and informed the research of the National Centre for English Cultural Tradition that sat within the University of Sheffield, as well as its aligned journal, which was called Law and Language, which is a lovely, lovely title. NatSec sadly closed, part of kind of a general culling, really, of folklorists at the university. And, obviously there's some high-profile cases of the English language sector kind of getting hard hit by current job losses as well. So not to sit on that too much, but NatSec closed in 2008. But all of its research contents and its archive was transferred to the University of Sheffield's special collections. And it remains a rich repository for interpreting local culture and community practice, albeit in England, obviously coming to the Scottish Council on Archives with an English case study. Forgive me for that. But, the archive really is quite important. It also preserves John Widdowston's call, who was NatSec founder, for a folklore survey that covered all parts of the country, both urban and rural, and from representatives of all ages and social and ethnic backgrounds. And this was quite important because it broke with ideas that folklore was inherently rural and that actually the urbanization, obviously experienced in industrial centres like Sheffield, was antithetical to ancestral culture. That basically, class elements meant that, people working in factories were focused on newness and modernity, and they weren't interested in this kind of very rich cultural tradition. And John Widdowston thought that that really was not the case, and there needed to be a more holistic study. So today we're going to focus specifically on an element of the survey, which is an element of the NatSec archive, the survey's B cards. So these are cards that were categorized around broad themes. In our case, these were categorized for the month of May and all the spring cultural traditions and stories that surround May. And these cards, which number about 150, already contain quite a lot of structured information that, just needs a little bit of extraction to make readily accessible. So these cards contain free text, which respondents could use to explain a folk story, fields for where the story originated and who it was first learnt from, as well as also, some demographic information as well from respondents. And this, follows traditions that folklorists use surveys all the time to systemize and interpret large-scale, diverse, contradictory, challenging cultural material. So actually, folklorists are some of the best humanities researchers at actually structuring complex information and bringing it down into, what we would describe as archivists, as metadata fields, right? And discrete units of information that someone might want to search against, within the archive. So there's a natural alignment between digital methods and the fact that a lot of this information is already quite structured. And permissions for this work were gained, from the university archives themselves, and helped by the fact that the survey was originally an academic exercise as well, so falls outside some of the the statutes and can be interpreted as a research exempted exercise as well. So in converting this analog survey and the survey cards into usable collections data, we trialed a range of approaches which form quite a long workflow, but hopefully I can break it down for you. So it starts with automatic transcription. We'll go through each of these in turn, bringing natural language processing, spatial mapping, and network analysis into bear as well. So these technologies were decided upon because, a lot of them are pre-built. They're made up of common tools, common code libraries and applications. They're accessible at little to no cost as well. Some of them are open source. Spacey, for instance, you can go on GitHub and access the root code. Transcribus, there's a lot of debate around the fact that it is an openly licensed tool. It operates on the freemium model. The base algorithms are not accessible because they, to a degree, support the livelihoods of the developers who work for the company as well, but it is backed by an academic cooperative of shareholders. So it's not entirely outside the DH or the archival field. We specifically did not want to use third-party commercial vendors who potentially, you don't know the core processes of what you're interacting with. But this workflow and using these tools required no internal development. And again, relates to that idea of DH not always using the state of the art, but sometimes using standard digital tools if there's a better use case. So, through processing the NatSec survey, we had our main research questions were around, wanting to better understand the methodology that Widdowson used, as well as, the survey's distribution across England, some of the kind of internal networks within the cards, who's referencing who appears as the main influence around kind of a lot of these local folklore stories, and also the main topics and the main stories that appear in these cards as well. These cards vary in layout. There's one on the slide. They contain a mixture of print and handwritten information, and therefore formed quite a good, again, gnarly case study for automatic transcription. We first converted them into grayscale, so a process known as thresholding, just within Python, and that enabled the cards basically to have greater image contrast, which aided the transcription. These cards are also printed on variable qualities of paper. I think to a degree, Widdowson and his team would hand them to anyone who would answer them. And often they ran out of cards, so they just shifted to lined paper with, random stamps for each field. And so, considering this complexity, they are a good candidate for trialing some of these automatic transcription tools. So we used Transcribus, the largest consumer-level ATR system, and that was used to manually label certain areas of the cards, constructing what are known as text regions that mirror basic content. So, for instance, we could label the from whom learned question as from whom, and also label core elements of the document, such as the title as well. And this enabled kind of more complex document understanding and certain fields to be transcribed and then exported separately into CSV files, making further analysis more intuitive, but also bringing that structured information back into archival catalogue records as well. We use these structured tags basically to train transcribers to recognize the layout through a field model, and that returned a kind of model with an accuracy for mapping these elements that was around 60%. So obviously it detected some of the elements of the cards, but needed to be manually corrected through human in the loop approaches as well. We then segmented the cards into lines, which allowed for corresponding digital transcription. And then we threw Transcribus's main transformer model, Text Titan, at the card because a lot of it is regimented print, albeit with a bit of handwriting. And this proved mostly accurate. Approximately 5 corrections per card were needed at the character level. And some common errors are actually quite interesting to interpret. So holiday, for instance, would appear instead of Friday. So, and errors with the word flower as well. There's lots of stories about, creating daisy chains, things like that. So you can see some of the transformer workings, that clearly Transcribus has predicted a certain word based on some, broader language pattern. And it thinks, okay, well, things we shouldn't, it predicts that obviously the story is talking about holiday, not Friday. So yeah, again, we needed to recognize these issues, appreciate that no AI output is immaculate, and manually check and correct these instances as well. So after correcting these transcriptions, we moved to kind of the interpretation side of the techniques that I'll go on and talk about. So we wanted to better understand how the survey was distributed across England, and also, where respondents resided and where stories originated from as part of that as well. So to better understand the locations held within the cards, we used a very simple natural language processing algorithm called Spacey, which is available as a standard package through Python to extract the place names from these corrected transcriptions. So again, these place names, although mostly accurate, were checked and some had to be corrected. In some cases, if you have person names, last names that are also place names, you need to disambiguate those instances, and there's some misattribution that can happen as well. After this was done, we gave these place names lat long coordinates. We geocoded them, again, using a common library called GeoPy. And again, corrected them to ensure that mostly that they were UK place names and not, American equivalents, for instance. And then this information, the card number, the place name, the date, and the geocode could be made more intuitive and interactive through accessible mapping tools. So this is Palladio, that again is an openly licensed mapping tool through the University of Stanford. And, this is a good case study for how clean transcriptions done critically can enable just simple data manipulation. And through that manipulation, suddenly you're viewing a very text-based, artifact, archival interfact, as a completely new data type to a degree, moving from pure text to a spatial representation of that information. And Palladio is great. It allows for interactive zooming between places. So you get this better understanding of kind of response distribution, and all this fine information, done semi-automatically through these Python libraries, can be re-imported back into the university's metadata catalog as well. So how were these folkloric stories transmitted? Collected by NatSec specifically for May. We will try and broaden and scale up some of these approaches. We exported, through Transcribus, through that fields model, we could decide to toggle and export only certain structural regions, so certain questions. So we exported only the from whom and learned from survey questions, made simple through that structured export. And again, through the natural language processing model, Spacey, we extracted named entities held within these responses, so people, places, events, other influences, for instance, main folkloric books that were referenced. And then we networked these in quite a simple way. This could be a far more intuitive, far more, that humanities side. It could be more critical. But basically, we created a very simple rule-based algorithm that if one entity, so entity A, was mentioned within a window of 10 words before another entity, entity B, it was seen to have this linear influence, this direct influence. And of course, like I say, this approach is limited. It returns to our initial discussion about needing to critique digital technologies, not treating them as givens, especially when we're dealing with inherently complicated information like a survey of folklore. But even saying that, through structured nodes, so entities and edges, so how these nodes relate, we were able to kind of see some main connections within Gephi, which again is an openly licensed free network analysis tool that allows for this mapping. The model, this visualization that you can see in front of you was based on what's known as in-out influence. So basically, the darker the node, the more connections it contained, the greater transmission broadly that node had over the survey. And then the edge weights. So again, the darker color the actual network showed that there were primary networks in a directional manner, and that shows to a degree kind of the main connections that appear in the survey. This was also done with what's known as a force algorithm. So the more mentions that a person or a place has in the survey, the more centrally it appears in the graph as well. So that shows you a very simple kind of, word frequency across the survey as well. So it's an interesting starting point for trying to think about this survey, I guess, more broadly than just the contents of each card in turn. So lastly, before a little bit of discussion and then welcoming any questions, to better understand how topics emerged and declined in these cards, we used our transcription data to perform, again, a very rudimentary topic model. So this is a method for discovering latent patterns and themes in text. So we standardized the dates in these cards. We've removed stop words, so erroneous text such as the and we lemmatized them as well. So that ensures that something, basically bringing words down to their root. So maypole dancing and maypole dance, dancing and dance would be considered as one and the same. We then counted the frequency of these terms and grouped them using BERT topic, which is a dynamic topic modeling algorithm to kind of show the evolution, again, very loosely, of these themes over time. And this resulted in the graph in front of you. Of course, it needs further refinement as well, just like the network graph, but it does reveal some interesting things. So we can see that certain stories had peaks and troughs. For instance, Oak Apple Day and terms related to Oak Apple Day. So yes, topic 0, so oak, nettle, apple, leaf. Peaked in 1973, they died down afterwards. And this was all around a celebration of Charles I when he hid during the English Civil War in an oak, fleeing from the Roundheads. And to commemorate that, boys mainly in South Yorkshire, where Sheffield is based, would hit girls with nettles if they weren't wearing an oak leaf. So again, like a lot of folklore stories, there's clearly quite a gendered element even in the 20th century to some of these stories as well. And this can be triangulated maybe against kind of royalist attitudes with further research. Does it peak in 1973 because of contemporary events? Does it die down for a particular reason as well? So in all these cases, topic modeling, network analysis, survey, and spatial analysis as well, it's all underpinned by quite critical and accurate automatic transcription as well as the raw images of the survey that were kindly provided by the scanning technicians at the University of Sheffield as well. But hopefully this collection demonstrates how DH methods can be used to better understand humanities problems, in the case of the content and distribution of local folklore and cultural customs. And of course, to interpret these resources fully, you do need to require a folklorist to a degree, which shows that DH methods are inherently collaborative and interdisciplinary as well. But even in this limited case, we've moved from static digitized images to more interactive collection resources that could maybe be built into digital engagement with users, fed back into internal archival processes as well, and supporting further digital scholarship. So I'm going to finish up. I'm conscious that I'm treading on the Q&A to a degree. But as suggested, DH approaches rely on structured data. However, folklorists will tell you that folklore is multinational, it's influenced by migration. It can be studied at the individual, family, community, and, global level as well. So there's an open question really around whether the methods that I've demonstrated today enable greater digital accessibility or whether they actually inherently flatten what is quite complicated material and culture, that's held within them. So, digital workflows can certainly have the potential to exacerbate what folklorists call fakelore, a term first coined by Dawson in 1968, which talks about, the distortion of quite serious cultural subjects via misinformation and inauthentic representation. Nonetheless, other folklorists are a bit more keen on digital methods and see such approaches in and of themselves as creating new folklore traditions digitally. So our use of, say, spatial analysis to better understand the survey of English language and folklore isn't it in and of itself a folkloric act. And certain themes are emerging, such as electronic folklore, all manner of really interesting stuff. So it's a digital humanities, humanists' job may be to balance these two arguments, to not focus on regimentalizing information to such a degree that you lose the cultural aspects, but also to think about how further structuring information can actually make folkloric heritage more accessible and interactive. So it's can be quite touchy space to occupy at times as well, and a complicated one as well. So where does the archivist sit in all of this? Well, I've given you a long history of DH. I've talked about GLAM labs, and also, the fact that a lot of DH projects originated with archivists as well. But again, there's a question at the moment about whether archivists' roles are research-driven. Do they stretch to the interpretation of resources? Or is it a matter of just providing resources to researchers who then run with that interpretation side? So are deploying methods like this on the NatSec survey, do they fall within the traditional role of the archivist, or do they kind of build on archivists' remits as well? However, we shouldn't maybe see all archivists as suddenly coding and doing the digital stuff as a given. It might lead to unfair expectations, as Morgan states, of digital librarians and archivists being seen as miracle workers at a time when everyone is working 1.5 people's jobs, and there's an ever decreasing pot of resources as well. That said, though, if you ever feel that you want to discuss some of these DH-related issues or building on your current kind of roles through digital humanities methods, touching on some of the things that I've gone through today, I'll direct you to our University of Glasgow, where I'm joining the course come August, the new Digital Humanities MSc, which hopefully will provide a practical and conceptual look at the DH field as well. And I know in talking with Tom and the Scottish Council on Archives that we're exploring the idea that we might do some more practical sessions as well. So I'll end there, and I thank you ever so much for bearing with the long talk that went from theory to practice, went through several methods as well, and I welcome any questions. I think we've got a good 15 minutes left. So thank you very much.